Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Late Payments in Europe, Breaking the Cycle to Accelerate Growth, co-hosted by Dun & Bradstreet and Baker Ring. My name is Markus Kuger, and I'm the Chief Economic Advisor at Baker Ring. Before that, I was the Chief Economist at Dun & Bradstreet. That's why I know both of my co-presenters very well. I'm joined by Lisa Baker-Reynolds, the founder and CEO of Baker Ring, and I'm also joined by Tim Wine, who's heading up International Finance and Risk Solutions at DNB, and both of them will introduce themselves with more detail during their presentations. Before we start, a few housekeeping issues. You're all put on mute. That doesn't mean that we don't value your input. Quite the opposite. We encourage you to engage with us. There are two options to do that. First is to ask us questions. We have set aside a lot of time for Q&A towards the end of today's event. And we will also ask you a few questions. We have 4 poll questions, and you can find them under the vote button in your BrightTalk application. So let's start with a macroeconomic presentation. And unfortunately, that won't be very cheerful. It's not my fault. It's the economic data that is rather disappointing at the moment. A lot of data series have deteriorated over the past few weeks. And I've selected a few of them, and I will start with high frequency indicators. Let's start with stock markets. And we're looking at the S&P 500 here, one of the most important stock market indices globally, but especially in the US. And you can see that nice dip on the right-hand side caused by the tariff announcements of Donald Trump. And since then, the S&P 500 has been in recovery mode. But as you can see, we're nowhere near the levels that the index was on in January and February. And we can see a very similar trend when we look at FX markets. And I've selected the US dollar against the euro here. I could have selected dollar versus pound, dollar versus yen. Would have been a very similar chart. We've seen a significant change in early April caused by the tariff announcements. Markets have become very pessimistic about the economic conditions in the US. And as a consequence, the dollar depreciated against the euro. That's why that chart goes up. And some of these losses were recouped over the past few days, but the dollar is still considerably weaker than it was at the end of 2024, at the beginning of 2025. Another indicator that has deteriorated recently is consumer confidence. And we're looking at the US here. We're looking at the composite consumer confidence index in the US. You can see that following the election victory of Donald Trump in November, the index improved, then peaked in December, but then in January, February, March, it has moved lower again. So American households are becoming more pessimistic. And unfortunately, it's not only American households that are becoming more pessimistic, it's also European households that are less upbeat about the next 12 months. Here you can see the Eurozone Consumer Confidence Index, that's the blue line. And you can see a particularly sharp deterioration in the UK Consumer Confidence Index, that's the red line, which has deteriorated quite significantly since mid-2024. And that is bad news for companies that are targeting the consumer markets. Budgets are constrained. It's very unlikely that households will spend on big ticket items over the next few months, and that will hold back economic growth, of course. When we look at the business side of things, the situation doesn't improve, unfortunately. Let's look at the US first here. And in that visual, you can see the US PMI composite output. Very long expression. What does it mean? Well, let's start with PMI. PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, a survey very often used amongst us economists. And the range of the PMI is between 0 and 100. 100 is the best reading. 50 is a neutral line, which means readings below 50 are bad and readings above 50 are good. Composite means we are looking at an aggregate of the manufacturing sector and the service sector. So when we look at that US PMI composite output index, we can see that the current reading is in growth territory, 51.2 points. It is above 50, not far, but admittedly it is in growth territory. The problem is that compared with March, it has moved lower. In March, it was still on 53.5 points. And the PMI is actually now on the worst reading in 16 months. The service sector output PMI is on the lowest reading in 2 months. Manufacturing has improved in the US, but we have to be a bit careful here. Manufacturing PMI in the US at the moment is very volatile because a lot of US manufacturing companies, they have brought forward purchasing activities. They were concerned that tariffs would be introduced, rightly concerned. So they bought a lot of stuff, and that is inflating the PMI. So at the moment, the US manufacturing PMI is very difficult to analyze, I have to say. Problematically, there is a sub-index called future sentiment. Survey respondents are asked, how confident are you that the next 12 months will look better than the last 12 months? And this forward-looking component has actually been deteriorating for 3 months in a row now, and it has fallen to the lowest reading since mid-2022. There is a split between manufacturers in the US and service sector companies. Manufacturers are generally more upbeat, makes sense. Tariffs will shield them, but manufacturers, they will face problems as well. We will come to that on one of the later slides. So US companies, mixed bag, I'd say. When we look at the Eurozone, similar picture. The composite output PMI in April, 50.4 points in growth territory, just in growth territory, above 50. Service PMI business activity, 50.1 points. So in growth territory, but even closer in growth territory. It's actually the worst reading in 5 months. Manufacturing is in contraction mode, 49 points, but it is actually on the best reading in 32 months. So manufacturing is improving, but it's not enough yet to lift it above that 50 points line. When we drill deeper, we can see that domestic new order inflow, so order inflow coming from within the Eurozone, that's actually on a 3-year high. That's encouraging. But at the same time, export orders, they are very weak. And similar to the US, when you ask companies, how confident are you that the next 12 months are okay? Companies are rather concerned. The composite year ahead expectations sub-index has actually fallen to the worst reading in 1.5 years. Last PMI is the UK, and the situation in the UK is much worse. The composite output PMI in the UK, 48 points, below 50, and is actually on the lowest reading in 29 months. When we look at new export orders, they have been falling to the lowest reading in 5 years. So no foreign company wants to order something from the UK, if you want to rephrase that. Yeah, that's not good news. The service PMI, which is the more important one, given that the service sector accounts for 80% of gross value added in the UK, is in contraction territory. It's on the lowest reading in 27 months. Manufacturing is on 44 points. That's very, very low. These levels don't happen very often, and that's the worst reading in 32 months. And the year ahead expectations, they are on the lowest reading in since October 2022. So the UK is certainly a country where business confidence is even weaker than in continental Europe. So now that I've mentioned a lot of deteriorating time series, I wanted to talk about consumer prices because it's actually one of the few bright spots. But unfortunately, I got overtaken by events. So I prepared the slides last week, and since then, the ONS has released new data yesterday. So my positive story about inflation isn't that positive anymore. But in a world where there aren't a lot of positive developments, it's probably still one of the better topics I can talk about. So consumer prices in Europe are no source of concerns, despite the recent data releases. And that's especially true for continental Europe. In the Eurozone, inflation came in at 2.2%. Just a reminder, most central banks, including the Bank of England, including the European central banks, they have a 2% inflation target. So 2.2% inflation versus a 2% inflation target, that's very good. Core inflation is a bit higher. Core inflation ignores energy prices, it ignores food prices, but it's no concern either. What we do see in the Eurozone, as well as in the UK, there is a split, and that has been going on for several years now. goods inflation is very low. Goods inflation in the Eurozone stood at 0.6%, while service sector inflation is much higher, almost 4% inflation in that sector in the Eurozone. In the UK, when I prepared the slides last week, the latest data point was March, inflation of 2.6% or 3.4%, depending on the index you want to use. CPIH includes a housing cost component. The Bank of England, the ONS, they like CPIH. I'm more a fan of CPI, but that's technicalities. The problem is that yesterday a new data point for April was released and inflation actually went up to 3.5%. That was expected, that was priced in. That's why it's not so much of a problem. Figures went up because gas prices went up, water prices went up, electricity prices went up, the minimum wage went up, national insurance contributions went up, and that had an impact. That's what's pushing inflation in the UK upward at the moment. The Bank of England expects this trend to continue. According to their latest forecast, inflation in the UK will peak at around 3.7% in Q3, and it will then moderate again. In the Eurozone, very similar picture. Inflation expectations are well anchored. Markets expect inflation of around 2.5% next year, not 2.9% next year, 2.5% in 2028. So compared with the levels that we've seen 2 years ago, 3 years ago, double digits in some countries, inflation is not a source of concern, and that gives central banks room to maneuver, and that is positive for interest rates. Here on the left-hand side, you can see interest rates on new loans in the UK for small and medium-sized companies. Inflation has come down. That's why central banks, not only in the UK or in the Eurozone, the Fed has done it, the Swiss National Bank has done it. Pretty much every national bank, central bank around the globe has cut interest rates last year, and some of them have actually continued in 2025 as well. And as you can see, interest rates have started to come down, and they will continue to come down this year. That's the good news. The bad news is, and you can simply see that by looking at the chart, despite the recent interest rate cuts, we're still far away from the levels that we've seen in 2009 to 2022, basically. So if you are rolling over a loan that you've taken out a year ago, you probably end up with a lower interest rate bill. But if you're taking out a loan or rolling over a loan that you've taken out 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, your interest rate bill will go up. And there's also another problem, and that is lending terms. Lending terms have tightened severely over the last few months and quarters. That means getting access to credit is more complicated as well, and that has negative ramifications on credit risk. So before we look at the most important indicator there is, real GDP growth, I want to ask you a question. So if you could navigate to the vote button, I wanted to ask you, how has the current macroeconomic climate changed your credit? No, that's not my question. My question is selected the wrong question. I wanted to ask you about macroeconomic conditions. I wanted to ask you, how has the current macroeconomic climate changed your credit risk strategy? Have you implemented stricter screening, shorter payment terms, or using more data, or have you not made any changes at all? So you have a minute to select an answer. And while we're waiting for the results, I will talk through the most recent data points here. And they're not very old. They're actually from the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, which was published in April. And let's look at global growth here on the left-hand side. Global growth this year, the IMF expects 2.8% compared with 3.3% last year. And that's bad news on several fronts. Firstly, 3.3% wasn't a spectacular growth figure in the first place. So from an already mediocre level, things will deteriorate. Second problem is that 2.8% isn't good. And it's especially not good because 3 months ago, in the last World Economic Outlook, that growth figure stood at 3.2%. So within 3 months, the IMF has lowered the global growth forecast by 40 basis points, quite significantly. And the biggest culprit here, or the country that has driven this development, is the US. The US has seen a sizable downgrade to its growth forecast since January. In January, the IMF had forecasted growth of 2.7% in the US. Now it's forecasting 1.8. China went from 4.6 to 4%. The UK went from 1.6% to 1.1%. So a lot of downgrades to growth forecasts over the past 3 months, of course, all driven by the looming trade war. So the results are in. We've asked you, how has the current macroeconomic climate changed your credit risk strategy? And 2/3 of you are saying you haven't made any changes. Stricter screening, 15%, shorter payment terms, 10%, and more data is used by 10% of survey respondents today. So despite the significant changes in country risk developments, you haven't made any changes to your credit risk strategy. That's interesting to see, and I'm sure we can talk about that in more detail during our Q&A session, because I wanted to show you how unprecedented times are in terms of political risk now. Let's look at geopolitics. And I've brought 2 charts with me here. The first one is the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. That's an index that tracks certain keywords in major global newspapers. And you can see that during COVID, it spiked, then it went back, and then Donald Trump returned to the White House, and that index is increasing very, very quickly. The second chart I want to look at is the Trade Policy Uncertainty Index. Same logic, we're tracking keywords again, different keywords this time. We're looking at newspaper headlines in global publications, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and so on. And you can see that that chart goes back to the 1980s. Not a lot of things have happened since then. Then COVID came, first spike, and then Donald Trump announced a lot of tariffs, and that chart is skyrocketing. So it's very difficult for companies to adjust to that high level of uncertainty. And that's all down to that looming trade war. I prepared the slides last week, and I had to make sure that I wasn't overtaken by events again. And if you followed the news, you obviously realize that things tend to change very frequently at the moment. So just a few key points that have happened over the last few months. On 2nd of April, Donald Trump announced several tariffs. Asian economies were hit in particular. He called that day Liberation Day. Not sure if that was the right term. Markets didn't respond to that very well. We've talked about the stock market. We talked about the FX market. And a week later, Donald Trump announced a partial suspension of these measures for a 90-day grace period. There was only one country that retaliated, and that was China. So the US and China got engaged in tit-for-tat escalations. And at the end of that, the tariff stood at 125%. So quite impressive. But 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump also granted a similar reprieve. So these tariffs won't come, at least they won't come for 90 days. But that doesn't mean that there is no trade war, because Donald Trump has introduced a 10% blanket tariff on imports. That's in place. And on top of it, countries like Canada, Mexico, China, they are facing additional tariffs as well. So I think at the moment, a lot of people forget that tariffs actually went up for pretty much every country around the globe. Maybe the UK is an outlier here, given the trade deal, but trade barriers have gone up. Global trade is more distorted than in 2024. So what's the potential welfare loss here? And it depends on assumptions. And I found a study last week from the Center for Economic Policy Research. It's an NGO in Brussels. And in their opinion, and that's not an outlier, that's general consensus amongst us economists, the country that will suffer the most from a global trade war is the US. It's not China, it's not Europe, it's not Germany, it's the US. Economic costs in the US will be significant. And depending on the severity of the trade war, the cost for the US will be around 2 to 4% of their GDP. Global GDP will only go back, will only shrink by around 1.2 to 2%. So the US is actually not in a good position to start a trade war. Donald Trump will disagree with that, and things have changed over the past few weeks, luckily, but global trade is not in a good shape at the moment. My final topic before I hand over to Tim is credit risk, and I will keep this short because I know that Tim will cover that in more detail. I want to briefly look at payments performance here. This is actually data from Dun & Bradstreet. I've been using that data for 15 years now. I joined Dun & Bradstreet in 2010, and back then, France was a very good country to deal with. French companies paid their bills on time, not as quickly as the Germans and the Dutch, but nonetheless, France was a low-risk country. Unfortunately, that has changed completely, at least since COVID. And that is also something that we're seeing in our own Baker-Ring data. There's a lot of demand for our services in France at the moment, or collecting French debt. And luckily, because I assume the majority of the audience will be from the UK, payments performance in the UK has actually improved last year. And now for the first time in 4 years, the UK figure is better than the European average. Generally, last year, we haven't seen a lot of movement from a European average perspective. The average payment delay in days, in B2B payments performance, that is, still stands around 12 days. So this is where we are. And I know that Tim will cover that in more detail. So last slide is business failures. Here you can see the developments in England and Wales, left-hand side, right-hand side, EU and Eurozone. And you can see massive spikes in continental Europe on the right-hand side. And unfortunately, figures still continue to rise. Business failures increased by 4% in the EU last year and by 6% in the Eurozone. When you look at the major markets, Germany, Italy, France, you can see double-digit increases. In England and Wales, last year was okay, I guess, -5%. That's good news. But we have to keep in mind that figures improved from a 30-year high recorded in 2023. And concerningly, that positive trend didn't last. When you look at Q1 data, you can actually see a 3.4% year-on-year increase again. So from a macroeconomic perspective, from a geopolitical risk perspective, from a credit risk perspective, it will be very difficult to do business this year. I'm sure you have questions for us. Please submit them with the questions button. And Tim, I hand it over to you now.
Marcus, thank you. Very interesting insights, and I'm going to build on that as we take it maybe down one rung to a company level and operating with your clients and with your accounts receivables. So as Marcus introduced me briefly, my name's Tim Vine. I head up the International Finance and Risk Solutions team here at D&B, and I'm going to talk through how we see trends around payments, trends around bankruptcies, both somewhat moving in the wrong direction, and then how we guide and advise and provide insight as to some form of best practice and approach that businesses can take to combat the risk of late payments and the knock-on impact that might then lead to in terms of business failures. So building on Marcus's last couple of slides, every year D&B and our worldwide network partner Cribis, we conduct an annual payment study. And we're releasing the most recent one this week. And it doesn't necessarily tell a great story. While there might be a couple of markets that are improving slightly, the headline, just over half of trade payments are made according to agreed terms, which means just under half are not. And they could be 5, 10, 15, 20 days late on average, depending on the market, or even longer. There's also a significant difference we've seen in the data between the two halves of Europe. So Northern Europe are prompter by quite some significant margin to Southern Europe. The line is drawn somewhere at the kind of UK, Germany level of the map. But the Southern markets for sure are performing much less strongly when it comes to payments. Less than 4 in 10 payments are paid according to agreed terms. And the implications of that are significant. And I'm sure you see that within your businesses, that you sign up to agreed terms, or you sign up to terms when you provide your goods and services in advance of being paid. And you would hope and expect that you would be paid according to the terms, because there's contractual agreements that suggest that you should be. But we all know that isn't necessarily the reality, and the stats back that up. And the impact that has on your day sales outstanding, your bad debt reserving, and ultimately your cash flow is significant, and it's a hard battle to strike. If I move that to one step further, and what that might lead to, which is bankruptcies, as Marcus touched on. And again, we conduct a global bankruptcy report every 12 months and have recently released the 2024 study. And although the increase each year is getting a little less, it's still increasing each year in totality. On the left-hand side, you see the cumulative bankruptcies across some key European markets. And from 2022 to 2024, it's almost like a 35-40% increase in bankruptcies in that 3-year period. On the right-hand side, you see some of the key markets and maybe the key offenders. Marcus talked about France a little bit, but in general, all markets across this study seeing a slight or fair increase, with the possible exception being the UK, which is pretty much flat over the last 2 or 3 years. And this is off the back of the COVID years, the 2020, 2021 years, where a lot of courts were closed temporarily, government-funded rescue packages almost delayed the impending bankruptcies for many businesses because there wasn't a process in place to write the bankruptcy. There was some catch-up, and I think somewhat through that catch-up now, we're still seeing a steady increase as we look across major European markets, which is obviously a concern. So you piece those two things together, the impact of late payments and also the prevalence of late payments, the increase in bankruptcies, you could be taken for thinking that's a pretty negative position to operate in. But there are ways to tackle that. There are ways to combat that. And hopefully I can give you some ideas. So before I talk through this slide here, we have a second poll. So again, the vote button at the bottom of your screen. The poll that's going to be opened up is asking the question, to what extent do you use external data in your credit risk decisions? From 2 ends of the spectrum, heavily integrated, occasionally used, rarely used, or not used at all. So again, a minute to vote. And as you decide where you are on that map, I'm going to talk through our perspective from a reactivity versus proactivity approach. I think the overall message on this slide is you can't afford to wait to react to things that have happened because it will essentially be too late. You don't want to be at the bottom of the list of creditors. You don't want to be at the bottom of the list of payees. You want to be first past the post. And that requires proactivity. Very easy to say to be proactive, much more harder to implement. But the implications of a lack of insight around how your customers and maybe your suppliers are linked and who they are and how they operate, and information to understand the credentials of the businesses that you're looking to provide goods and services to, leads to lack of control over cash flow, late customer payments, not really knowing where to look within your customer base as to where to focus yours and your team's attention to drive out the bad and maximize the good. There could be untapped opportunity for growth, but there's also going to be hidden pockets of risk within your customer base. Ultimately, that impacts cash flow. Unmet revenue impact requirements, challenges around day sales outstanding, time to get cash in bank, and ultimately impacting your cash flow. So if we have a look at the poll, just under half of you heavily integrate external data into your credit risk decisions, and over a third occasionally use. So kind of more than 4 out of 5 of you are using to some or some significant degree external data in your credit risk decisions, which is good to hear. Obviously, from Dun & Bradstreet, it's what we would recommend. And you only know what you know if you have an inside view of your clients. You don't necessarily know how your customers are performing to others and the implications that might mean and the knock-on impact that might mean for you. Then as we think about the difference between onboarding companies that you don't have a relationship with and managing the risk of customers that you do have a relationship with, which is really where the risk lies. Until you onboard customers, there is no risk. It's a perceived risk. It's a future risk. We conducted an analysis across one of our product platforms that our clients use for credit risk management called Finance Analytics. And we had a look at all of the companies in all of our customer portfolios across all markets around the globe from a risk perspective from D&B. This is what we are saying at a specific point in time around the potential financial health or stress of the businesses that our customers have as their clients. And as you might expect, it's a fairly normal distribution. It's a bell curve, the majority in the middle risk categories and the minority in the outliers. But I would draw your attention to the orange and the red, which is just a shade over 20% of the companies that our clients are doing business with, and presumably have got outstanding debt with, are in a moderate to high or severe risk category from a D&B perspective. Now, typically from an onboarding perspective, these are the businesses that might not be a straight through onboarding. They might not be a green light. You might have to make a more detailed assessment. You may even turn away for credit. What we see, though, is that actually as a customer portfolio grows, the risk changes. And actually what this portrays is a slightly higher risk position of our existing customer portfolios than we would otherwise see. A lot of the 18% would be probably turned away from a new client onboarding, certainly the 3%. And actually, that's where I want to focus the attention on, and that will lead through into what Lisa's going to talk through, is the real risk you have and what really impacts your cash flow is the risk of your existing customers, not the perceived risk of those who you aren't yet doing business with. And actually, from a D&B perspective, as we move from the dark orange to the red, we withdraw our credit recommendation, which would result from our recommendation to not extend credit. Clearly, if those businesses are operating well with you as existing clients, it may be that they represent an acceptable risk for you, but it may be that you're the last one that they can afford to pay, and it may be the impending cliff edge that your clients are reaching, and that could be the shock or the surprise that you then have to react to. The point being, a proactive approach in your existing customer base and the risk of your existing customer base, both from what you know managing your clients, but also from an external perspective, is critical to enable you to get ahead of the curve. And Lisa's going to talk a bit more about that when it comes to a receivables management strategy going forward. So I'm going to leave you with 3 takeaways. Firstly, it's never too late to start. If what I've shared through here has given you any alarm bells or any shocks that you're seeing, well, it's never too late to start. Begin the approach as soon as you can if you haven't already, or improve the approaches you take as best you can, to ultimately become proactive and get ahead of the bad news that might be around the corner. Secondly, an always-on view of the risk of your existing customer base. Gone are the days of the annual health check or the once a year I'll do an assessment of a customer, because you may have just missed a significant change, or you may be just about to miss a significant change that really impacts the potential of that client going forward. So an always-on monitoring, actionable insight approach will enable proactivity and enable efficiency and move towards a much more streamlined flow, ultimately to get better control of your cash flow. And then thirdly, not losing sight of solid credit risk principles that I'm sure you and your teams hold in good stead, which is ultimately you as a business know the size of your debt, you know the age of your debt. You don't necessarily know the risk of your debt. From your perspective, in terms of how you deal with those customers, quite possibly, but how those businesses are operating in the outside world, maybe not. So that kind of trinity of 3 is really, really important to think of the foundation as you manage your existing book of business going forward. With that being said, I'm going to pass over to Lisa, and she's going to carry the conversation on. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. There's some great insights there, and working in the receivables industry and working with companies at the back end of the client cycle, you can certainly see a difference in a company's KPIs when they're more predictive towards risk as opposed to being more reactive. But good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lisa Baker-Reynolds. I'm one of the co-founding directors of Bakering International. We are a global receivables management company, and we work with companies in their working capital optimization, supported in bad debt and international litigation. If I may, before I start, I'd just like to ask you a question. I'll put up another poll. So what value bracket does your collections team proactively contact your clients before an invoice due date? I've asked this question because it's quite interesting at the moment. A lot of companies are investing in technology, quite rightly. But it's very much a debate on around balance, as in contacting and speaking with your customers and purely just relying on technology. There's definitely a fine balance to be had there. Something we've noticed is the more resource a company has, or the more time they have to proactively engage with their customers, they certainly see less default and their KPIs are much stronger. But of course, saying that, that's not always so easy, is it? There's always time constraints. There's often lack of budget to extend your team. But the results are looking quite interesting. So I work with some companies, and they don't actually proactively even contact a customer once they go overdue, unless they're like a £50,000 account. So these results are quite interesting. And what it's showing us is that quite a large percentage of you only contact your larger accounts before the invoice due date. And of course, what we find then is once the invoice becomes due, if you haven't already spoken with them, you get your common objections. Oh, I need a copy invoice. Oh, there's a mistake with this invoice. And something that can be really frustrating is if they have an invoice, if there's one mistake on there, they won't pay the whole invoice. So rather than just paying what they don't have an issue with, they wait until you resolve all of the issue. So I'm going to come back onto this in a moment, because I'm going to speak a little bit about resource. And I think resource is something we really don't speak enough about within credit management, resource and time and efficiency. Just going on to what Tim was speaking about around being proactive and the importance of credit risk, I would like to extend a little bit more on propensity to pay. Because once you've extended the credit to a customer, no matter how robust your credit risk process is, once you've onboarded the clients, we're no longer really looking at, will they pay me? We're looking at their propensity to pay, and we're looking at, can they pay me? And those credit scores, they're different because they look at different variables. So we work with global companies, large corporations, and something we're doing a lot more of at the moment, and something that's becoming quite popular and more in demand of our consultants, is something which we refer to as our peak payment model. What we'll do is we'll take a company's ledger, we'll consult and work with them, and essentially we're balancing their appetite for risk, the amount of resource they have as a business within credit and collections, and their profit margins, which I'll come on to in a moment. So late payment trends, there's nothing new, is it? They're not going to stop either. We're always going to have late payments. We're always going to have changes and movement in political risk, in country risk. The issue credit management has is, how do they prepare for that? And not just how do they prepare for it, but how do they strategize, and how do they change their credit management policy when they see it occurring, or they can see it's about to happen. Because yes, there might be a change in country risk in a certain industry or in a certain country, but like I mentioned, it's very rare a CFO will come to you and go, oh, I notice a big change in risk here. Here's some budget. Please go and employ more heads. That doesn't happen, right? So when dealing with late payments, some of the best credit managers and some of the best order to cash directors and leaders I've ever worked with, and I've worked in credit management around 20 years now, a common trait I find they have is they reject the status quo. So for example, your commercial team might come to you and say, well, we have to give 120 days credit in Italy because that's what's done. Or our competitors are giving extended payment terms in this country, but you might not be happy with that risk, right? And a strong, credible credit manager has the confidence to reject the status quo and say no. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? It's easier said than done, because we're in a commercial world. We all want to trade. The sales teams can be quite strong, particularly if you're working in a company where not necessarily sales rules the roost, but they have got a strong say in how the business is run. So I just wanted to give you a tip. How often has this happened to you? Somebody in the commercial team have come to you and said, we need to extend £1 million credit to this company, or this company's worth £1 million to the business. Well, in reality, it's probably not, right? The contract value might be £1 million, but the profit margin might be £200,000, right? So when you're dealing with a commercial team, or when you're dealing with a sales team, particularly when you're in difficult situations or you're having difficult conversations, don't speak in contract value, speak in profit value. because that's when the CFO's ears peak, if you like. So what we've devised within Baker Ing, because we invest quite a lot in data and we like to run retrospective testing and work with different algorithms, we've found that 60 days beyond term is the sweet spot, if you like, or what I like to refer to as the seesaw within critical risk. So what you find is when a debtor starts paying later than 60 days, you see a serious deterioration in that company's propensity to pay you. Not only in their propensity to pay you, but also in the profit margin as well. Sorry, with me. So just going back to what I was saying about resource. So a lot of companies work on the Pareto rule, right? So 80% of your business will come from 20% of your clients, which is great. But the problem you have is that 80%, if you take your eye off the ball, or if your team are dealing with an increase in risk in some countries, and they don't have the time to penetrate and work that 80% of the smaller businesses, that 80%, their days beyond term is starting to spike and go like this. Now, if you spend all your time focusing on the top 20%, yes, it's going to hurt you if one of those are late paying, but you've got a bigger problem on your hands if the volume in your 80% will start paying late as well. So it's very much a catch-22, yeah? And going back to the issue of resource, you have to strategize it. You have to use it well. Yes, I believe in excellent technology. Like I said, so many of our customers are investing in that. But also what we do is we work with companies and we support their internal team when it comes to possibly the 80%, I would say, the larger volume of clients, where maybe because you want your team focused on the 20% or the bigger value key accounts internally, you just haven't got the time to proactively speak with your clients. Something we do, and something I recommend you guys do, is run what I refer to as a RAG report. It's basically red, amber, green. So you take your whole global client ledger, you take the aging, and you append the credit risk scores. And if you've got access to them, I'm sure Tim can help with this, but don't just add the credit risk scores, look to add the propensity to pay scores. And critically, if you can, add the profit margin or profit score for your customers. And what you'll see is quite quickly where your team's time should be prioritized. And it's quite surprising, the report that comes back. If you can, because like I said, not all businesses will allow you to employ more staff. If you start seeing late payment trends, you have to manage that internally, but work with a third party. Look to outsource some of the accounts. We're not getting the time that they deserve. And by doing that, what you'll see is protection in the smaller value accounts, and you'll quickly see a huge increase in your DSO and your days beyond term as well. Just going to my last point around managing late payment terms. So we might have a UK-centric audience here today, and a lot of companies will say, well, okay, there's changes in global risk. And we've already seen from Marcus's poll, right? People are not changing their credit management policy. And it might be because you're not trading with areas or territories that are difficult or paying late. But something that we must remember is the domino effect, right? So if we're working with a UK company and there's one of our key accounts, they're good for credit, right? You've got no worries about them. What happens? We need to look at their supply chain, because they might be trading strongly in these countries where there's issues. And very quickly, we'll see a domino effect whereby they're starting to get paid late because of the issues with political risk or country risk. And then you're going to get paid late. So going back to some of the best credit managers I've ever worked with, they know quite intimately what their key accounts supply chain looks like. They know who they are within the supply chain, and critically, they know where they stand as a priority creditor. A tip you can use to become more of a priority creditor, but particularly in high risk countries or in high risk industries, is use shared payment information. So as a company, how we work when we look at a debtor, we know that company isn't paying our client on time for whatever reason. We need to understand, okay, who else are they trading with and how are they paying them? And that's very powerful information for your internal team to have access to. We do work with Dun & Bradstreet and many other bureaus to look at the shared payment information, and use dual messaging when you're communicating with your customers. So just a tip I would recommend. A lot of companies don't realize that if they are paying you late, it's affecting their credit score. It's affecting their own ability to get credit from their suppliers. And this is, and trust me, this really does work. If you speak to a customer and say, just to make you aware, we do share payment information. And do you know that by paying us on time, you'll improve your credit score, improve your credit rating, and you'll get better financial terms? You can turn that on its head as well, if you want to, in a delicate way. But you can say, just to let you know, we share payment information. And if you're paying us late, it could affect your credit score. It could affect your ability to get credit elsewhere. And finally, what I would say, nothing works better in getting a debtor's attention when you say to them, oh, but I notice you're paying your other creditors on time. I notice paying this company. I notice you're paying that company. Because the first question they're going to ask is, how do you know that? So the more prepared you are in dealing with late payments and dealing with difficult companies, the better, really. So I'm just going to circle back to Marcus, I think. Well, if you want to mention the page. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for giving us all that excellent advice on how to collect invoices. I think, from my perspective, at least as a country risk analyst, macroeconomic conditions aren't great. Political risk is immense. Business failures are still elevated, are continuing on the rise. Payments performance, we can see probably in a more detailed breakdown once the Dun & Bradstreet study is out later this week. I'm eager to get my hands on that. And there's another excellent resource that you can use, and that is the Credit Hub section on the Baker Ring homepage. There's a lot of complementary thought leadership content on it, from country fact sheets that deal with legal environments, what the usual terms are. There are sector reports out there. There are the more macroeconomic reports on it as well. It's all free of charge. And before I forget it, I tend to use this slide to invite people to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you haven't done so yet, I tend to invite people to follow Baker Ring on LinkedIn to stay informed about these reports. I think I'm speaking on behalf of D&B to invite you to follow Dun & Bradstreet as well as Tim on social media, just to stay informed about the very frequently updated news releases that both companies are publishing. Before we reach the Q&A session, there is a final question that we wanted to ask you, and that is, what is the biggest challenge in breaking the late payment cycle for you? Is it customer transparency, outdated credit policies? Is it economic volatility, or is it monitoring tools? And while we are waiting for the results, let's dive into the Q&A session. And I've seen a question about Ireland, and that was, any comments on Ireland and how you expect the Irish economy to perform in the next 12 months and whether credit risk there will increase? I guess that's a question for me. And let me answer that in true economist fashion. It depends. That's how economist answers normally start, because it truly depends on what you're comparing against. Are you comparing Ireland against the rest of the Eurozone? Are you comparing Ireland against the UK? Are you comparing 2025 against 2022? Generally speaking, the outlook for Ireland is good by Eurozone standards. The IMF expects real GDP growth in Ireland to come in at around 2.2, 2.4%. That's very good. Eurozone average is 0.8. So just gives you an idea of how well Ireland will actually perform next year. The government deficit will be low, unemployment will be low, inflation will be no problem. So from that angle, things look okay. But then the problem is that when you compare the Irish performance or the expected performance in 2025 against the medium to long-term average growth rate in Ireland, it will be a challenging year for the Irish economy, and that's not surprising. Ireland is very integrated into the global economy. It's home to many multinational corporations, very often from the US. So whatever the Trump administration is doing in the US will have significant ramifications on Irish GDP. And then there's always a problem with GDP in itself. It's probably not a great measure to assess Ireland's well-being. Normally, I'd say GDP is a good measure to assess how well a country is performing. But in Ireland's case, it's not working properly. I think I'm not sure who it was, but 10 years ago, the term leprechaun economy came up. Basically, Ireland's GDP is very volatile simply because of intellectual property rights being relocated from the US to Ireland, software, patents, planes within the balance sheets of large airline companies. So to answer that question, Ireland will be doing well by European standards, but it won't have a stellar year. So let's have a look at the poll result that has come in. And 72% have said that customer transparency will be the biggest challenge, while economic volatility and outdated credit policy, only 4% of you think that these are the biggest challenges, and monitoring tools around 20%. So transparency is an issue. Tim, Lisa, do you want to share your views on that?
Going back to what I was saying really around shared payment information. I'm not speaking badly about any credit reference bureau, Tim, and please don't shout at me. But sometimes, when we're using credit reports, we're very much reliant on the last year's filed accounts. Now, as we know, a lot can happen in a year. Well, a lot can happen in a week if you're in the US. So it's really important to get as much live information as you can on your customers, and use things like look. You wouldn't have time to do this for all of your customers, but certainly for your top, for your key accounts, look at them on social media. Look at what they're doing. Are they expanding? Are they retracting? I'm absolutely an advocate for shared payment information and credit circles as well. Speak to your peers in your competitive companies. Understand how companies are paying them. It's quite surprising what you find out as well.
A couple of thoughts from me. I couldn't emphasize even more the importance of payment data and shared payment data. Yes, financial data is historical by its nature. Actually, from D&B perspective, it's about a third of the weightings of our scores. So therefore, 2/3 of the weightings come from fresher, more recent data with a lot of emphasis on trade. So companies that are sharing their accounts receivables ledger with D&B and other companies like D&B enables us to build up a really independent picture of how companies are paying everybody, not just maybe the 3 trade references they're asked to provide when they're looking to be onboarded. So recent, dynamic, frequently updated data is absolutely critical, and that keeps you well versed on the events of today rather than the events of maybe a year ago. What I would, I think, also say related to this question is the importance of identifying the difference between companies that can't pay and companies that won't pay. Transparency of your clients is key, and clearly 3/4 of you saying that's the biggest challenge. It can be very hard to understand your clients that are using you as a bank and customers that genuinely can't afford to service the debt that you've extended to them or the credit you've extended to them. And looking at the comparison of your customers versus how they're operating with others, which is something you won't necessarily see just looking at your own book of business, will help you to establish and understand those that are in financial stress and therefore probably can't afford to pay you, and maybe the next bad debt write-off, but those who are doing actually financially fine, but are using you as a bank to improve their own cash flow. And you can have very different collection strategies if you can identify the can't pay versus the won't pay, which sheds some light on the transparency issues that you're flagging.
Can I just add to that as well, Tim? Something where I find D&B are very strong. You don't just give a credit score, you use many different algorithms. So you'll have things like, you actually have propensity to pay scores, you have payment scores. And I think that's really helpful. Don't just look at one score, use a multitude, use as many as you can.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Tim. For me as an economist, 4% think that the economy is the biggest problem. And I've shown you the charts. Situation isn't great. Uncertainty is high. But then I've been doing that job for 15 years or so. And I joined during the global financial crisis. Things weren't great. I worked in the UK, so Brexit was a big topic. Then came the cost of living crisis, the Ukraine war, energy prices, COVID, of course. So doing business over the past 15 years has always been challenging, but companies found a way around these problems. And I'm sure the trade war is a major topic for at least exporters and importers for larger companies. But I'm sure that it won't be the end of the world. And with the help of D&B, with the help of Bakering, companies can prepare for this very challenging environment. So we still have a few questions that came in from the audience. So maybe, Lisa, one for you. At one level, should DSO be considered a cause for concern for a company?
That's a good question. And the truth is, it really does vary. What I see, I think where it varies the most is a company's appetite for risk and also the profit margins that they make. So if you're working in an industry where your profit margins are very small, then obviously you're not going to suffer late payments as much as if you're working in a service-driven industry where your profits are very high, right? Like I mentioned, 60 days beyond term, that really is a sweet spot because it's proven that payments after that stage, the likelihood of payment deteriorates as well as your profit margins. So really, I would say 60 days, but it depends by country, and depends ultimately by your appetite for risk.
Thank you, Lisa. Tim, I think there is a question for you because it's about distinguishing between can't pay versus won't pay. So how do you distinguish between these two groups, and which collection strategy do you recommend for these two scenarios?
I'll answer the first piece.
Yeah. I just thought the second piece is probably suited for Lisa.
Kind of the practical execution of it. Certainly from a D&B perspective, it's why we have a couple of predictive analytics. One is looking at the financial viability and likelihood to fail over the next 12 months, called our failure score. And one is looking at the likelihood to pay more than 90 days beyond terms over the next 12 months, which is our delinquency score. If you look at those two in parallel, in combination, actually a very simple way to start to differentiate between can't pay and won't pay is companies that have a very positive failure score, i.e. are financially sound, but have got a very poor delinquency score and possibly the payment score in terms of how they have paid historically also, they are the ones that are potentially using you as a bank. They can afford to pay you, they're choosing not to. On the other side of the mirror, if companies have got a high risk of failure in the next 12 months, they are more likely to be the ones that can't afford to pay you, particularly if they also have a poor payment performance and poor forward-looking payment performance. So really, I would say isolating those that are choosing not to pay you even they can afford to is a positive failure score and a negative delinquency score from our analytics. Treat those differently. And you can have different collection strategies because some are cash richer and some are cash poorer. Maybe, Lisa, you can suggest practical collection strategies for the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think engagement with the clients and conversation is critical. You know, as a company, we don't just, something we will never do is just send letters or send emails because people can hide behind them. You know, you have to get on the telephone, you have to have conversations with these people and also request meetings. Not so much now, but I know maybe years ago, credit managers would be out on the road actually, you know, go to meet customers. Understand why they don't want to pay you. You know, you need to positively motivate them to pay you. And you need to explain to them what the negative consequences are of not paying you. Just a tip here: sometimes the debt can be small, you know, and debtors are savvy, right? If they know a debt is small and they're thinking, well, you're not going to pay to go to court, you're going to write this off. You're not going to take me to court. But going back to that shared payment element, if you explain to them that actually there is a negative consequence, if you don't pay me, it will affect your credit score and you might not get credit elsewhere, and that you'll share that with their supply chain, that's a good motivator to get someone to pay.
Thank you, Lisa, for that advice. Conscious of time, maybe a final question before we wrap things up. And Lisa, that one is for you as well. How relevant do you find company share prices when determining credit facilities? Is that something you consider as important?
So obviously we don't extend credit, and maybe this is possibly a bit more for Tim. It's a really interesting question, actually. But what I would say is something that I would look at when mediating with a client, and they're saying that they're cash poor, they've got working capital issues. Because this is where a lot of companies find problems, right? They experience bottlenecks. So they'll say, "Oh, I haven't got any bad debt." Well, you might not class it as bad debt. It's not paying, and it's not paying for a reason. But that's actually a really good point to look.
Yeah, maybe I can share a couple of thoughts. I think from a credit assessment perspective, actually we don't find it to be particularly predictive. And there are a lot of factors that influence the share price. Some of those that Marcus has talked through from a macroeconomic perspective. And also, on one end of the spectrum, the share price could be rocketing. The valuation of the company could be rocketing. The market cap of the company could be rocketing. They're in absolute growth mode and the market thinks they're going to grow fantastically in the future. But in some ways, growing pains and growing too quickly can be the downfall of a business also. That it might not be a purely positive story if the share price is going through the roof. It's going through the roof for a reason. And there is a risk that the companies overextend too quickly. So actually, we don't find the company share price itself to be particularly predictive as an element to determine credit facilities. It's a bit more disconnected. Certainly the financials of a business that influence the share price, and if they're listed and they're producing quarterly reports for the investors and for the street, the two are connected, but we look more at the financial statements, interim financial statements, rather than the resulting share price to assess the trade credit limits and the credit extension that a business might be suitable for, rather than the share price itself.
We've run out of time, so I think now is a good moment to wrap things up. I want to thank you, Tim, and you, Lisa, for joining me today, for your insights. I want to thank everyone who has participated, who has asked us questions, who has answered the polls, and I hope you found this webinar as insightful as I did. And thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.